I'm Sukant Chandan, and this is the first event of the TriContinental Anti-Imperialist Platform, which basically is an initiative trying to fill a gap where there obviously is one, and I consider that actually there's been this gap throughout my political life, which has been since the mid-90s. And what is that gap? That there's been a vacuum, that there hasn't been a Global South-led movement in solidarity with the homelands. Basically, the people who are going to bat and lobby and defend the Global South are those people directly affected in the Global South by imperialist policies in those lands. It's not going to be middle-class whites who control most of the left in the West, and it's not going to be elements from the Global South who are at best vacillate and are very unstable in their defense of the Global South. So it's these problematic elements which control the movements actually throughout most of the West, and including England. And seeing that vacuum, the initiative of the TriContinental Platform is to fill that by leadership and initiative taking by our peoples in the diaspora currently here in England. So this is the first event. The website is going to be launched in the next few days. And also we have a second event. Welcome, Rob. We have a second event on April the 13th, which is in commemoration of what I've said is the latest and the last greatest martyr in the struggle against imperialism, which is brother leader Hugo Chavez, who tragically has passed away just a few days ago now. So on Saturday, April the 13th in Bruce Grove in Tottenham will be the commemoration, the life and legacy of Hugo Chavez, which ties into another really defining uprising within Europe, and actually in terms of the Global South alliances within the so-called West. Primarily the alliances is with struggles like the Basque Country, who've actually been fighting imperialism within the imperialist heartland, there's going to be a speaker from the Basque Country National Liberation Movement on Saturday the 13th of April. But also it's a commemoration of the Easter Uprising of 1916, which Lenin, doesn't matter how much you like or dislike the guy, but he correctly defined as one of the most important revolutionary uprisings in the rough period of the First World War, in the world and in Europe in particular. So it's combining Hugo Chavez and the Easter Uprising. But today's event is a retrospective of the last 10 years of the anti-war movement, and the resistance of our people to imperialist war has really defined me politically throughout my political life, and I'm sure that's the same for most people in this room today. But really we need to take stock of what's occurred in the last decade plus, because basically you're not going to get it from the mainstream anti-war movement. They had a conference just a few weeks ago, and it was an exercise basically in patting their own backs. I don't think that's really does justice at all, and I'm being very diplomatic with my language in terms of where we're coming from and in terms of what's happening to our people and our challenges for liberation, and the challenges for solidarity from here to our people in the homeland as well, which I don't think has been adequately been achieved at all or been addressed. Some of the problematics that I find on a domestic front is when you are actually bringing black and Asian people to demonstrations which are basically criminalized. It's a grey area, but you can easily be criminalized for having solidarity with Palestine or Somalia or Iraq or Libya elsewhere under the draconian anti-war legislation. Unless an anti-war movement has a solid legal defense strategy, you're basically inviting our youth onto political activity without any real political equipping of defending themselves. My own family members have been put on trial for work against the war against Iraq in particular. There was no support from the mainstream anti-war movement. When Operation Cast Lead happened in end of 2008, beginning 2009, our young people got very militant on the demonstrations in support of Palestine. And again, the mainstream Palestine solidarity and anti-war movement were absent in defending our young people in demonstrations. So actually it was an initiative of myself and friends who actually developed the Gaza demonstrations Gaza demonstrators' defense campaign, to actually come to the defense of our young people on the demonstrations, and then to support them when them and their family are going through the court system in this country. So on the domestic front, there's an absence of legal defense and a viable legal defense. On an international level, it seems that the mainstream anti-war movement fears more the resistance against imperialism than it does imperialism itself. That it's failed to develop real internationalism with resistance throughout the continents. And it seemed to, because the way that the mainstream anti-war movement made its particular alliance actually tied itself to very narrow regions of the Global South, particularly the Middle East, and they did not focus on any other area of the world where imperialism has been conducting war. There's been a war against, actually, like I said before, the whole system itself is a constant and escalating war against any obstacle to its total domination against the world. There's been an open war against Zimbabwe since the late 90s. Not a word from the mainstream anti-war movement. As the brother said, there's been actually a proxy war, hardly a proxy war, in DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And again, not hardly a word from the mainstream anti-war movement in this country and across the West. There's been a war against South America, throughout my political life. And that's most obviously manifested in the way the British basically are going to war with Argentina. When you send your military ships into an ocean far away from your pathetic little island of the cold northwest corner of Europe, that's an act of war. And they're occupying Argentinian land, which the British wrongly called the Falklands, which is called Las Malvinas. All right? And when the anti-war movement actually started, none of the so-called current leadership of the anti-war movement were there. In the late 90s, I remember myself and my colleague Dan Glazebrook went on demonstrations and organized against the NATO war in Yugoslavia. None of the people who were in the Stop the War coalition now were on those demonstrations and involved in that imperialist war that happened. And actually things have come full circle from Yugoslavia till today. So what we found with Libya, and Libya really exposed everything, and Libya was a blessing in disguise in a lot of ways, because it showed really where everyone stood. Lynching of blacks became liberation, according to the anti-war movement, right? That's what happened. And NATO war became liberation. Death squads became liberators. And that's continued with Mali and Syria, etc. And it goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on, right? And there's been some really interesting contributions already, but I am going to continue, and that's just a way of introduction to kind of really frame today's event. I'm really happy to that we have the speakers that we have today, which really should be the leadership of the anti-war movement. Welcome, brothers and sisters. Right. I mean, really, it's people like on the platform today who should be, a part of the leadership, and I'm sure a lot of the faces on the platform are familiar faces to you because of the work and advocacy they do for our and their peoples. So first of all, I'd like you to welcome someone who I've worked with previously back in 2001 or 2002, is Mr. Riyad Al-Tahir, who's probably one of the most hard-working and self-sacrificing patriots for the Iraqi cause against British policies, British war policies, which has been going on for generations and generations and generations, actually. Actually, it was Churchill himself who practiced upon our people in Iraq the first chemical attack in 1920.